this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
In the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean was a battleground unlike any other during the Second World War. While massive aircraft carriers and battleships dominated the headlines, a different kind of naval warfare was fought in the shadows, one of speed, stealth and surprise. Armed with torpedoes and machine guns, the small but deadly PT boats waged a relentless fight against Japanese convoys, warships and outposts, proving that size wasn't everything in naval combat. I'm Angus Wallace and this is the World War II podcast. So joining me today is Mark Stille, a naval historian and author of PT Boats versus IJN Destroyer. We'll be exploring the role of these fast attack boats in the Pacific, their success and challenges, and how they're squared off against the Imperial Japanese Navy's formidable destroyers. Welcome back, Mark. So we're looking at PT boats, which come into their own during the Guadalcanal and Solomons campaigns. The T of PT is torpedo. So perhaps we should start with torpedoes. I'm not sure what the history of the motor torpedo boat is. I guess it is a weapons platform for the torpedo, but I'm not sure when they came about. I think the British had them and were using them during the First World War.
So most of the European navies were pretty heavy users of PT boats in some shape or form before the First World War, during the First World War, and going into the Second World War. In particular, the British used these, and the Italians were also successful users of PT boats in the First World War. And the Japanese also were big into small torpedo boats. They really weren't PT boats. They weren't that small, but they were torpedo boats, as they were called, small destroyers, essentially, as early as the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and 1905. So the Americans were behind the times, though, in that regard. They didn't really see a use for them because they had to fight across two oceans. So a PT boat's a very short-range platform that the American Navy didn't see any use for. But that changed in the 1930s when they began to think of ways to defend the Philippines. And also they wanted to keep up with these European navies. So it wasn't until 1938 that the Americans got serious about PT boats. So that's when they put out in July requirements for two types of PT boats, for a big boat and also for a smaller boat. But still, these were both short-range platforms. The American Navy wanted them to carry only two torpedoes, and they were lightly armed with machine guns. But still, that was the norm at the time. These were small boats in the range of 80 tons, 48 tons to 80 tons usually, with a short range, usually in the area of 300 nautical miles, maybe up to 500 nautical miles. So when the Navy put out these requirements for these two kind of boats, there's a lot of interest for various builders in the States to get involved in that. They got a whole lot of proposals for the large boat. There were 13 design submissions for the large boats and 24 design submissions for the small boats. And of these, two were selected. That's when the Navy began to consider and start mass production of these PT boats. But in the end, they decided to go with the larger design, the large PT boat, because they had a greater range. So that's when the Higgins Yard in New Orleans got involved. They were very famous small boat builders at the time. They won a contract for the larger boat design. Also at that time, there's a late submission by a British designer, and the design was purchased by the Electric Boat Company in the U.S., also known as Elco, Electric Boat Company. So the Higgins Company and Elco became the two mainstay developers and designers and builders of U.S. Navy PT boats.
It's incredible, isn't it? Higgins sort of comes from nowhere in that late 30s, early 40s to dominate that small boat building. It's enormous business as Higgins by the end of the war. Had Higgins pulled his design from out of thin air rather than copy a British or a European design?
His design was original. He did not copy a European design. He had built other types of small boats, and this was useful when he morphed that into a PT boat design. Designs that these two builders originally submitted, they had to be increased in size because late in this design process, the U.S. Navy changed its mind, and now they told them that they want 4 torpedoes on these boats and not 2 torpedoes. So the boats that were originally submitted were not big enough to carry 4, so they had to be redesigned. So Elco went to work to modify its 70-foot design, and they came up with a 77-foot design. And in fact, they had already built a bunch of the 70-foot design boats for the U.S. Navy, and these were given by the U.S. Navy then to the Royal Navy early in the war. And in fact, I live right across the street, literally across the street from the place where they built these 70-foot design torpedo boats for the Royal Navy and the Soviet Navy. I can see it from my window right here, actually. But those weren't the ones that the U.S. Navy wanted. They wanted a bigger boat. In fact, those 77-foot Elco boats, those are the first ones that showed up off of Guadalcanal. For mass production, they settled on an 80-foot design, Elco did. So the standard boat for most of the war was an Elco 80-foot boat, and they built 358 of those. So that was they were built in large numbers. But this is an 80-ton boat, not that big. It had a top speed of 41 knots and a max range of about 550 nautical miles. So still a small boat, but it was on the high end of a PT boat design. The Germans, of course, had a larger boat, but compared to the other Allied navies, these were pretty big boats. So Higgins, on his own dime, he redesigned his original boat and came up with a 78-foot boat. That was the standard boat that they built for most of the war, and they built 221 of these 78-foot designs, and these also showed up off of Guadalcanal late in the campaign. So the Americans really went through a lot of effort to get this right before they gave these big contracts to Higgins and Elco. They had a whole bunch of interest in PT boat design because there were a lot of small boat companies here in the U.S. So in the middle of 1941, as America was ramping up to enter the war, it looked like war was going to be likely. So they held what they called at the time the Plywood Derby in the Long Island Sound to have all these designs pitted against each other so they could pick the best one. And that's when the winners were clearly Elco and Higgins. So that's when they got the big contracts for these PT boat construction. And those are the boats that were used early in the war against the Japanese.
They weren't actually made of plywood, were they?
They were. Well, not plywood, but they were made out of wood. Yeah. There was some aluminum on the boat, but that was just the bridge part of the boat. So to keep weight down and to keep these boats as fast as possible, they were built out of wood.
I'd always just assumed they were steel.
Well, no. Well, that means that this yard across the street from me, who built boats to fish in the Chesapeake Bay, that they could be put to work building PT boats. So
how are they out? Do they just have 2 or 4 torpedoes? Is that all they thought they were needed? They have radar. I mean, I assume they must have radar, because radar would seem like, if you've got torpedoes, would seem kind of a handy thing to put on a torpedo boat.
Well, it would. But like I said, they went from 2 torpedoes to 4 torpedoes because these were meant to attack major fleet units. So they weren't built to attack, to deal with other torpedo boats. They were built to attack major enemy fleet units. So that's why you need 4 torpedoes. So you have a better shot of doing damage. So yeah, you'd think radar would be a good thing, and it was a good thing, but it didn't get onto PT boats until early 1943, and it didn't get to the Pacific until the middle of that year. So that meant that all the PT boats that fought off Guadalcanal, that none of those had radar whatsoever. So that made it hard to pick up targets at night, low visibility. Radar was not a thing on PT boats until the middle of 1943.
Is there a technical reason? Do we not have enough radar sets, or it was the size of a house?
Well, they did have to get a radar that was small enough for a small boat. So it was a radar called the SO, And the Navy had different priorities. They had to get radar on the larger ships first. So the SO radar, which was a fine radar and well suited for a PT boat type, ship, for use aboard that kind of a small boat. That wasn't ready, though, until early 1943.
So, I mean, you mentioned that the Japanese had actually looked at torpedo boats earlier in the century,
Yeah, but their idea of a torpedo boat was, like I said, as a small destroyer. So the Japanese did build some true torpedo boats for use during the war, but they were never as successful as the Americans, nor were they as widely used as the Americans. And the reason is, rather unclear why the Japanese, when they were forced on the defensive, why they wouldn't invest more heavily in this kind of low cost, fairly effective torpedo boat.
Well, on the same sort of then, did they consider them potentially being a problem and being attacked by American torpedo boats? Were Japanese destroyers prepared for this sort of asymmetrical warfare?
They were totally unprepared. The Japanese didn't foresee this kind of threat. So the Japanese destroyers were very good for what they were designed for, but they were designed to be torpedo platforms. And they were very good torpedo platforms because they carried this excellent torpedo, the Type 93, which is known most often as the long lance. But of course, a long lance torpedo is of no use against a fast-moving torpedo boat. So the Japanese destroyers were well trained. They were a big part of the Japanese decisive battle strategy. That was the strategy they had come up with to take on a larger American fleet, in which the destroyers played an important role because they had to whittle down the size of the American fleet before this big battle took place. And that's going to be done by destroyers attacking at night with torpedoes. So very well trained torpedo platforms. And of course, they also trained at other aspects as well. Gunnery and maneuverability were practiced heavily. And that was of use against a torpedo boat. Gunnery and maneuverability are good ways to thwart torpedo boat attack. But Japanese did not foresee a threat early on by American torpedo boats.
So their main defense against them going to be just their anti-aircraft gun? Did their anti-aircraft even depress that far?
Yes, the Japanese destroyers at this time only carried a couple, and by couple, that's really all they carried, 2 twin mounts of 25 millimeter anti-aircraft guns. So not a lot of weapons on board suitable against a fast-moving target, but they did use the main battery. Destroyers carried usually 6 5-inch guns and 3 twin turrets, and they were useful against torpedo boats. The main defense against a torpedo boat is the high speed of the destroyer and its ability to maneuver against an incoming threat or against a torpedo that's fired from a PT boat. So usually the bigger ship was at an obvious advantage against a torpedo boat, but that wasn't always true in some scenarios, as we'll see when we talk about the Guadalcanal campaign.
So with the massive expansion, of the US Navy, I mean, doesn't Admiral King get eventually told that he can't have any more ships because they're running out of people to crew them? Presumably, if you've got all these PT boats, they need trained crews. My assumption is a small crew needs to be an experienced crew. Where are they finding crew and captains to crew the PT boats?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because you're right. There was a big problem trying to man this 2-ocean navy that King was building at this point. But the crew requirements are rather small for a PT boat. The original designs we talked about, the crew was only 10 men. So you're 2 officers, 8 enlisted guys. The officers came from the early point in the war, at least, came usually from the Naval Academy, which is about, half a mile from where I'm sitting right now. But PT boat was an attractive option for these guys because it's, like you said before, it's glamorous, and there's the prospects of being able to engage the Japanese, being able to fight the enemy quick, now, and not waiting until your other ship is built and deployed to the Pacific. So if you want to get at the enemy quickly, join the PT boat force. So they tried to find guys with sailing experience or small boat experience. And of course, they couldn't man this whole force with just Annapolis graduates. So they quickly devolved to using reserve officers. So that's when they went to look for guys with sailing experience or small boat experience. And that meant that, in many cases, who could afford to own a small boat at this point? It was the more better off people in New England or the mid-Atlantic states. So there were a lot of college graduates, a lot of Ivy League graduates in the PT boat force, and the PT boat force had the luxury of being able to take only highly motivated and qualified volunteers. These were volunteers. The men on board the ships were usually petty officers, so they're a bit more experienced than your typical sailors. So you're right; these crews were a bit more experienced than the norm. They were very tightly knit because they lived together on these small boats for extended periods. So the men were a cut above the rest of the Navy. So eventually the Navy established a dedicated training squadron, which was located up in Melville, Rhode Island, which is right by Newport, to train these crews.
What are the conditions like then if it's 10 to 15 men on a small boat bobbing about? If it's short range, that means they're back every day for a billet somewhere on shore, or do they physically live on the boat for days and days on end?
They lived ashore. They couldn't live on the boat. But when you're on this boat for a patrol, and when they were off Guadalcanal, for example, a patrol would start at, say, 1800 or 1900 in the evening, and they'd be out all night, and they come back at 0700 the next morning. So you're on this boat for an extended period. Obviously, this is a small boat, so it's going to be a rough ride here. So it's a very draining experience to be on this boat for that period of time. And then living ashore wasn't any picnic either. On the Solomon Islands in the Guadalcanal campaign, they lived on a Tulagi Island, which is across the channel from Guadalcanal. There's a small naval base there. It was pretty arduous stuff there on Tulagi because it rained every day, so there's a lot of mud. It's obviously high humidity. Living conditions were not very good. They lived in these clapboard huts there on Tulagi. There's a near total lack of support for the PT boats when they first arrived on Tulagi. And then you had these constant patrols, which were very draining. So the men were exhausted there pretty early. They got there in October, which we'll talk about, and by November they were spent. And plus, it's hard to maintain these boats. Each boat had 3 engines, which had to be kept in top shape for top performance, and they didn't have a lot of maintenance support with them. And it's hard to fuel these things. They used aviation fuel, and they had to do it out of drums. So just getting the boats, keeping the boats operational was a challenge at this point as well.
So what are they tasked with at Guadalcanal and the Solomons during those campaigns? What are they expected to be doing? Are they just acting as recon?
Of course, there's a long backstory behind how the torpedo boats ended up off Guadalcanal, but as you're probably aware, and most of the listeners to your show are aware, the Guadalcanal campaign went on for months. When the Americans invaded the island in August, they quickly took over the airfields, and they brought an aircraft there by 20 August. So they ruled the waters around Guadalcanal during the day because they had control of the air. But then at night, the control of the waters around the island changed, and the Japanese were in control at night. And the Americans were reluctant to commit surface ships after their defeat at Savo Island, the first days of the campaign, when the Japanese had shown that they were superb at night fighting. So after that point, the Americans didn't want to use large warships, destroyers and cruisers, to contest the nightly Japanese supply runs to the island. So that's when they came up with the idea of using these torpedo boats, because it was a low-cost way to use these expendable boats to harass the so-called Tokyo Express. So it wasn't their intention, nor did they think that they could bring in PT boats to stop these runs to the island, but they could make these runs less efficient and take a toll over time against the Japanese destroyers used to make these supply runs. And that's what they did. But the first PT boats didn't arrive off of Guadalcanal until 12 October. And by that time, the Tokyo Express was already well established.
How were the organized? Are they hunting in packs, or are they sort of lone wolves on a night?
It kind of depended how many boats were available. So PT boats were given, obviously they were given numbers, not names, so they weren't commissioned, but they were organized into PT boat squadrons. So each squadron supposedly had a nominal strength of 12 PT boats, and there were divisions of 4 boats in each squadron. So that's how they were organized to fight. That's how they trained to fight in these divisions, but that wasn't possible off Guadalcanal. So they were hard pressed to keep boats operational. So, for example, there were 8 PT boats on the island the first couple of months of the campaign, and only 3 or 4 usually were operational any given night. They usually had forewarning through various means that a supply run would be conducted on a given night. So they would be able to deploy their boats accordingly. And usually they would operate in groups of, and not as single boats, in groups of 2 or 3 perhaps. And if they could, they would do it in 2 groups. If they had more than 2 or 3 boats, they would operate in a couple of groups. There'd be a main group that would be deployed where they thought the Japanese would be unloading supplies, and then a second group somewhere else as a reserve to react to events. They were just hard pressed to deploy enough boats to be effective at this early point in the campaign.
Well, how effective were they at disrupting these Japanese supply runs? Did they cause the Japanese problems? Because one problem that they do have is the US torpedoes, not exactly the most effective.
Yeah, that's true. So that's I guess one ironic aspect there, that you have this PT boat, and a PT boat lives to fire torpedoes at the enemy. So you have to have a good torpedo, or else it's not much good. So as we're all aware, probably those listeners to the show, the U.S. Navy had a lot of problems with its torpedoes, not just PT boats, but the torpedoes that the submarines used, the torpedoes on the destroyers it was a hot mess at this point in the war. So the standard PT boat torpedo was the Mark 8, and that was a World War I era destroyer torpedo. It wasn't a very good torpedo even when it worked. It had only a top speed of 29 knots, so it had an okay range, but it had a low top speed. But the real problem was it was unreliable. Just like on other American torpedoes, the contact exploder often failed unless it hit the target at a 90-degree angle. So that doesn't happen that much. So that was a problem, and the gyro often malfunctioned, so the torpedo would run erratically, and that was a problem. In fact, as we'll talk about, during the entire Guadalcanal campaign, when the Americans fired dozens of torpedoes, I don't have the exact number, but it was over 50, dozens of torpedoes fired at Japanese destroyers. Only 3 hit a target. And of these, 1 was a dud. So the entire campaign, they gained 2 torpedo hits with the Mark 8 torpedo. So that's a real problem, obviously. Now, later on, for the Solomons campaign, when they moved up to the Central Solomons, they had the Mark 13 torpedo, and that was the aircraft torpedo, which by this time, it had problems in the war earlier on, but by this time, the problems were fixed. So, but during the Guadalcanal campaign, the torpedo was a real problem.
What was that perceived threat from the torpedo a problem for the Japanese? Did they have to alter what they were doing?
They did. So even though it was rare to have a destroyer struck by a torpedo, they still didn't want to expose their valuable destroyers. And these are large destroyers. The Japanese built, for the most part, very large destroyers. So typically, the Japanese fleet destroyer was 2,000 tons or more full load. And the Japanese didn't have that many of them, nor could they build that many of them during the war. So these are very valuable ships, and the Japanese didn't want to expose them needlessly to torpedo attack. So the Tokyo Express is a fascinating case study of how the Japanese tried to support their campaign on Guadalcanal. The only method they had to support their troops on Guadalcanal was by destroyers, because since the Americans had air control, the Japanese were not able to move convoys in to the island. Now, they did try this on several occasions. On one occasion, it was partially successful, but for the most part, the only way to get troops and supplies to the island was at night, and that meant by destroyer. There were some ships that were larger, that were fast enough to also be used on the Tokyo Express. That's what the Americans called these runs from the Shortland Islands, which were located south of Bougainville Island, down the so-called the slot towards Guadalcanal. So this was the nightly Tokyo Express. If the Japanese timed this correctly, they could use these high-speed ships to get to just outside of range from Guadalcanal by the evening, and then make a high-speed run at night to the island, and then unload quickly at night, and then head north and get back out of range before morning. So that was the premise of the Tokyo Express, to use the speed of the destroyers to avoid air attack. So they got to the island, and at first there was no torpedo boats to contend with. So the Japanese were able to pull up in a small cove somewhere and unload with small boats. They still had to do it very quickly, because they wanted to get out as quick as they could to head on their way north to get out of air range, but it was a fairly benign environment. But when the torpedo boats showed up, that wasn't the case anymore, and even the Japanese had to adjust. So that's when they went to an even more inefficient method of getting supplies ashore. And that's when they just dropped drums off the side of the destroyers, hoping that they would float ashore, or that the garrison could get the drums and drag them ashore. And that really didn't work very well, but it meant that the destroyers were less exposed to PT boat attack.
Using a destroyer as a transport, which it can't have been a very efficient transport, a destroyer, because you've got to get your logistics off the side to shore. So then you think, well, that's dangerous. So let's just drag some drums behind us with supplies in and tie them together, and hopefully those ashore will be able to fish them out when we let go of them.
This whole thing was, I think it was criminally stupid for the Japanese to think they were able to support a major land campaign on Guadalcanal by such inefficient methods. There were two major occasions when they tried to run a convoy to Guadalcanal. One was partially successful, and one was totally unsuccessful, or almost totally unsuccessful. So that meant that destroyers carried the burden, and each destroyer was very inefficient. As you said, it carried about 150 men and maybe 30 or 40 tons of supply. And you couldn't carry heavy weapons on destroyers. You couldn't carry artillery or vehicles on these destroyers. These were soldiers and their equipment for the most part, or supplies, which is what they carried, later on in the campaign. And it was very inefficient. And later in the campaign, when the American blockade got tighter and tighter, they had to use submarines for the same mission. And that was even more inefficient, because each submarine carried about only 20 tons of supplies. The Japanese just didn't have many alternatives here. So that's why they had to use destroyers and then later on submarines.
And you're whittling away very expensive assets doing logistics operations.
Right. And the Japanese Navy wasn't very happy about that at all, because these were important assets. These were expensive ships. These were designed for that major decisive battle against the Americans. So as the Americans whittled away the destroyer force by air attack, not by PT boat attack for the most part, but air attacks and just the strain of keeping the force operational was a heavy burden for the destroyer force to bear. So that's why by December, the Japanese Navy wants out of this. And they told the Army that they weren't going to run the Tokyo Express anymore. So that would have left the guys on Guadalcanal high and dry, who by this time were already in desperate straits. They're already literally starving. So Admiral Yamamoto, who's the commander of the combined fleet, he felt duty-bound to support the Army. So they did make a couple of more runs to the island in December, but late December is when they decided to evacuate Guadalcanal. They could not keep the attrition to their fleet and still be able to fight this decisive battle in the future. So that's primarily why they decided to evacuate from Guadalcanal.
Was it similar at the Solomons? Well, of course, they've got the Mark 8 then, so that presumably they're even more of a potential threat of PT boats.
By that point in the war, though, the American Navy had transformed itself. It had enough ships and enough confidence in its night fighting ability to think that they could contend with the Tokyo Express with destroyers and cruisers. So after the Guadalcanal campaign, the Americans and the Allies too, there were also Australians and New Zealanders involved in this fight as well. So the Allies were moving north, and that's when the scene shifted to the Central Solomons. And there was a battle over New Georgia Island because there was a big airfield there on New Georgia Island. So there was a similar scenario there. The Japanese could not move convoys to New Georgia Island, so they had to use destroyers once again. But there were a lot more opportunities there to use barges in the Central Solomons. So the destroyers were active getting troops to a certain point, and then they would barge them down to New Georgia. But anyhow, the same thing was in play here. There was a Tokyo Express run several times during a month, but now the Americans decided to contest that with major fleet units. There was only one occasion in the Solomons campaign when the Americans tried to use PT boats to take on the Tokyo Express. And that was the famous incident on the night of 1 to 2 August when the Americans put out 15 PT boats to stop this force of only 4 destroyers coming down towards New Georgia. The operation was a total fiasco. The American commander thought that he could control the PT boats from ashore, that he could move them around by radio to react to Japanese movements. That was totally impractical. 4 of these boats actually had radar at this point. The American commander sent those off early from the scene, so the rest were left blind. But this is when PT 109, and we all know who the commander of PT 109 was, when he was rammed and sunk by a Japanese destroyer. So that was the only occasion during the Solomons campaign when PT boats were used to derail the Tokyo Express, and it was a total failure.
That's JFK's was the commander of PT 109, wasn't he?
That would be JFK, right? 35th, I think, 35th president of the U.S. But he was using the typical PT boat tactic of the time. So a PT boat's prime attribute during these battles, it wasn't speed like you would think, because it was so fast. But because if you're going 41 knots off at night, you're going to make a huge wake, and that's very visible at night. So your principal attribute as a PT boat commander is stealth. So you patrol at a very slow speed, like 5 knots, so you make no wake hardly, and you wait for the enemy to come by so you can get a shot with the torpedo. And that's what JFK was doing. He was at low speed, and this destroyer, the Amagiri, which was a special type destroyer, a very large destroyer. The destroyer commander later admitted that he saw this PT boat and he steered to ram it intentionally. And that's what happened. The boat was sunk and most of the crew survived, but that's when the JFK legend came into play, because he did perform heroically trying to get his crew back to base.
Loyal listener, we're going to take a short break. We'll be back in a moment. They also saw action at Leyte Gulf, quite a large number of them, didn't they?
They did, yeah. So the PT boat saga doesn't end in the Solomons. It did go on throughout the entire war, but by this point, though, in 1943, mid-43, the PT boat became primarily a barge hunter. The Japanese used a lot of barges off New Guinea and in the Solomons, and the PT boats were ideal for shooting up barges. So they modified the armament of the PT boats. When they were first built, they didn't carry a lot of guns. They carried only 50 caliber machine guns, but later in the war, they used bigger weapons so they could take on these barges that were armored in some cases. So they put 20 millimeters on board the PT boats. They then put a 37 millimeter gun, which was, at first it was an Army anti-tank gun, but then they also had an Air Force automatic 37 millimeter gun from aircraft. And then later on, they put even a 40 millimeter Bofors gun onto these boats, trying to shoot up barges. So they were successful to some degree in that role. But still, even in the Solomons, for example, the Japanese were able to move their garrisons off of New Georgia. They were able to evacuate the garrison off New Georgia and other islands using barges. So the PT boats were never able to stop barge traffic off of New Guinea or in the Solomons. But like you said, though, they did have a couple of more chances to get some shots in at the main Japanese fleet. And this took place at Leyte Gulf. Before the Battle of Surigao Strait, there were 39 PT boats involved in that battle. They were quite active. They did achieve a torpedo hit against a Japanese light cruiser, which was coming up through Surigao Strait to attack into Leyte Gulf. And the light cruiser was eventually, it was reduced in speed, so it was crippled and sunk later by U.S. Army bombers. Also, later on in the campaign off Leyte, when the Japanese were trying to run convoys into the port of Ormoc, which was in the western part of Leyte Island, the PT boats were deployed there again, and they also were able to sink a destroyer and other smaller ships during the Japanese attempts to reinforce Leyte Island. So the PT boats were, I think overall, they were a cost-effective way to contribute to the blockade off of Guadalcanal and the Central Solomons, and later on in the war, places like Leyte, like you were just asking about. I mean, they weren't able to stop the Tokyo Express, which wasn't their expectation, but they were certainly able to. They were a valuable part of that overall American effort to ratchet up pressure against the troops on Guadalcanal, and they were a valuable part of the blockade operations at Guadalcanal and other places.
Slightly curious, at the end of the war, did the US Navy feel that there was a place for PT boats in the US Navy, or did they revert to their pre-Second World War belief that there was probably no need with two large oceans?
Just like the Royal Navy, small craft did not really survive in that immediate post-war period. But then when the Americans got involved in Vietnam and they had need for small craft, then they rediscovered the utility of a small, fast PT boat-like craft.
They're fascinating because they're sort of sexy, aren't they? Zipping about PT boats. There's kind of a mysticism to them. Am I right in saying, is there a film about them or even a TV series? I've got vague memories of watching some PT boats in jungles somewhere on the TV.
Well, there was a wartime epic film about PT boats. I think it was called They Were Expendable. It was about the PT boats in the Philippines, if I remember. So PT boats are glamorous, like you said. They're fast, they're daring. How can a small boat that weighs only 40 tons, sink a 2,000-ton destroyer? Well, you do it with daring and bravery and torpedoes. Now, in actuality, it's hard to do all that. But this first film talked about these PT boats off of the Philippines, and there were a small number. I think there were 6 PT boats in the Philippines, and they claimed a lot of success against the Japanese invasion force. They claimed a lot of kills against various Japanese ships, but none were confirmed. But then, if you remember, the PT boats were used to evacuate MacArthur and other high-ranking officials from the Philippines. So that's a glamorous operation right there. And then I don't recall the years, there was another show called McHale's Navy, which was, I guess it wasn't maybe popular over in the UK, but McHale's Navy was about this guy McHale and his PT boat. And of course, there are all kind of other hijinks that he was up to, but he was a PT boat skipper. And occasionally they would actually have some combat scenes where, of course, the PT boat would blow up these Japanese ships with great regularity. So the PT boat's always been seen as a very, if you will, a very glamorous branch to serve on in the Navy.
McHale's Navy. I don't think I've seen McHale's Navy. It's got Ernest Borgnine in it. Well, anyway, I'll add that to the watch list. Thank you, Mark. Folks, if you want to know more about PT boats, check out PT Boat versus IJN Destroyer. It's one of those small books from Osprey. I think it's in the Duel series. Now, don't forget, if you've enjoyed this episode, you can support the show by becoming a patron at patreon.com/WW2podcast. By becoming a Patreon, you'll gain access to ad-free episodes, allowing you to fully immerse yourself in every discussion. Plus, you'll unlock occasional exclusive bonus material that didn't make it into the main show. So, to sign up, go to patreon.com/WW2podcast. Well, that's it for this episode. So until next time, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our tank, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.